In 1937, LaSalle didn't just build beautiful cars, they also sold more cars than they'd ever done before. And yet, just 3 years later, LaSalle was gone. So what happened? Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter in the automotive evolution here once again at the Martin Auto Museum, a great collection of more than 170 cars in Phoenix, Arizona that tell all kinds of interesting stories about the evolution of the automobile. And I love the story of this car right here, this 1937 LaSalle. A little while ago, I did a video and I asked you, which cars do you want to see us do next? And this is the car that folks said they wanted to see as our next profile. So that's exactly what we're doing. By the way, don't forget to like and subscribe, and in the comments below, let me know what I got right, what I got wrong, and what you think about this story about the LaSalle. Now, this is not the first video we've done about LaSalle. In fact, there's another one we've done in our Automotive Evolution series about a 1930 LaSalle that's just a little ways over here in the museum. But boy, when you look at that 1930 LaSalle, you realize how radically different it is than the car that came just a few years later. It's very boxy, old school styling. But in 1934, LaSalle came up with a completely different look, much more streamlined, much more stylish looking. In 1934, 35, 36, this is the evolution of that styling, and I think they did an absolutely beautiful job. Now, in that previous video, we also talked about the evolution of LaSalle, how it came to be, how it was named after an adventurer who, went down the Mississippi. You can go back and watch that video if you want to learn more about that. But LaSalle was designed to slot in between Buick and Cadillac. But while Buick was its own separate division, LaSalle was supposed to be a companion to Cadillac. It was actually being built by Cadillac employees. It had a lot of Cadillac parts. In fact, this body, when you look at it, is very similar, almost identical to the 1937 two-door coupe that they made for Cadillac. So it wasn't just another division. This was a companion, a part of Cadillac. It had Cadillac quality all the way throughout. In fact, that was one of their big advertisements for them back then. You could actually get it serviced by Cadillac dealerships. But while LaSalle was designed to be a companion to Cadillac, by the 1937s, it was actually a very different car. Now, in the beginning, it was supposed to be a sportier Cadillac, but by 1937, they were really making it an entry-level Cadillac. And in fact, just a few years before this, they had begun cutting the prices in 1934 so that the LaSalle was more affordable. In fact, while a Cadillac for 1937, the base Cadillac was going to cost about $1,445, this car right here was going to cost you $995, about $450 cheaper than a Cadillac. And once again, the body style was almost identical to what you were going to be able to get on a Cadillac. So this was a great way to get some Cadillac style, Cadillac design, Cadillac comfort in a less expensive car. They pitched it as the lowest priced and finest LaSalle ever built. Now, when they first came out with this body style in 1934, they actually got to pace the Indy 500 because it was so spectacular. And in 1937, they got a chance to do it again with this car right here. Now, that was the convertible, but still, the LaSalle was pacing the Indy 500 in 1937. And why not? I mean, you look at the streamlined body, how beautiful it is. And once again, if you look at a 1937 Cadillac two-door coupe, the body is almost identical to this. In just a moment, I'll walk around and talk about some of the differences, but you think about it. For $450 less, you were basically getting a Cadillac with the LaSalle name. I'm going to walk around that LaSalle from 1937 in just a second, but first, here's that 1930 LaSalle Series 340 touring car that we did earlier. Remember, look how boxy it is, how upright it is. Here's a 1929 Cadillac Dual Cal Phaeton. And think about this, just a few years later, this is what automotive styling had become. Look at how much more sleek it is, how much more stylish it is than it was just a few years earlier. You had to have a new LaSalle, a new Cadillac, a new styled car back in those days. So let's talk about some of the differences, though, between the Cadillac and the LaSalle. They're very subtle. I mean, one minor thing right here that you'll notice are these chevrons, these three chevrons that are on the front of the fender. The bumper itself was a little more simple than it would be on the Cadillac, still kind of stylish. Perhaps the biggest change was in the headlights. For a Cadillac, the headlight was actually a little bit further forward, mounted right about here. This streamlined pod, this almost bullet-shaped headlight right here was a little bit further back. It also had this tall inlet section. I'm not sure if it actually goes through. I think it may be more stylish than anything else. Cadillac did not have that. Now, on the LaSalle, it has these sections right here that go down. On the Cadillac, it's got a smaller section that go back and look just a little bit different. But you just get the same basic idea. The grille, very subtle differences again, but once again, everybody loved the styling of this grille, and why not? Remember, just a few years earlier, this is what grilles look like. So think about this. What a beautiful design and how stylish it was. Now this has the optional spare tires that were mounted in the fenders, which was a very old school way of doing it. In fact, we can look at this Cadillac, which is right next door, and you can see how it was done there. Yeah, a little more streamlined, but didn't take long before that would go away as well. Still had running boards, and look at the way it all goes back here with this big, long, beautiful back end, massive trunk right there where you could fit all kinds of stuff. Now, they were still doing things with small pieces of glass, but it was still more stylish than it had been just a few years before. We've got the split in the middle, and then when you go up front, you can see the split down front as well. Smaller pieces of glass, just a few years later, they would go to the larger wraparound pieces of glass. But once again, from a styling perspective, think about how much more spectacular this was in just a few years of the automotive evolution. Harley Earl, who actually was the original designer of the LaSalle when he first came to GM and then ultimately became the head of GM styling, he was a big fan of the LaSalle because the LaSalle was really where he got his start. So he wanted to make sure that the LaSalles had just as much style, just as much grace as the Cadillacs did for their time. The big news for LaSalle in 1937 was this engine right here, a V8. Now, as I mentioned, the body style itself had come out in 1934, but for the previous years before this, they were using an inline 8-cylinder engine, you know, all 8 pistons in a row. That engine was good for 105 horsepower. This is the engine that had been in the 1936 Cadillac, developed for that Cadillac, V8. And everything was different about it in just about every single way. I mean, first off, the way it was mounted onto the frame was better. It had a special mounting process they used that gave less vibration. It was less noisy. They did some valve silencing as well. You didn't hear that tappet noise. It had better carburation, and it produced 125 horsepower, so it had better performance. It's what they call a monoblock casting, which was unusual back in those days, where both the block and the cylinders were all cast as one unit, which is what we think of today, but monoblock was the term that they were using back then. So let's think about this. It's 1937. You're debating between buying a Cadillac and buying a LaSalle. You're getting the engine that the Cadillac had the year before, that 125 horsepower V8, and you're getting the body that is almost identical to what the Cadillac was selling in 1937. And you're getting it for $450 less. Why wouldn't you buy a LaSalle in 1937? Which is why the sales numbers were so good that year. They actually produced 5 different LaSalle models in 1937. There was the 2-passenger coupe, this one right here. The convertible coupe, that's the one that paced the Indy 500. A 5-passenger convertible sedan, a 5-passenger 2-door touring sedan, and a 5-passenger touring sedan. I want to take a moment to talk about a very significant styling change that happened with General Motors in the mid-1930s. And that's when they came out with what they refer to as the turret top. Now, if you think back to battleships and gun turrets, where they had an actual piece of metal that was going all the way over the gunner in the gunning position, that's exactly what this was designed to be. Now, you have to look back just a few years earlier in automotive design. The problem was that almost all of those earlier vehicles actually had a fabric insert in the roof of the car. And the reason being is that they had a hard time coming up with a process to make a large piece of metal that covered the entire top of the car that was both strong and consistent in terms of its style and its look, which is why for so many years you actually had a cloth insert with these pieces of wood, these slats that would go across, and that's how they made the roofs. In the mid-1930s, General Motors and Fisher Body, which was the design company, came up with what they called the turret-style roof. The idea of having a roof that was metal that went all the way across. Now, they actually had to come up with a new stamping process to stamp the metal, but it was pretty effective. And of course, the big pitch was that it was safer. They actually had an old film of a car with a test driver, a daredevil, who took the car out and rolled it and then got out, making the point that these turret top style cars were actually safer than the cars that had come before. They were also easier to take care of in just about every way, but the turret top style, well, of course, this became the norm in all of cars very quickly. By the way, the next year they came out with something called the Sunshine Turret Top, which, as you guessed it, was a sunroof built into that stamped metal top. While the LaSalle was designed to be pretty close to a Cadillac, it wasn't quite a Cadillac. Inside, it wasn't quite as luxurious as you were going to get when you got up to the Cadillac name and the Cadillac price, but it was still pretty nice. They were advertising the fact they had 100% wool. They really talked about the fine tailoring, the beading that was going across all of this. One of the things that was also significant for 1937 was they were using these ventiplanes. They called it no draft ventilation, no draft ventiplanes. Now, we're used to seeing these on a lot of cars since then, but the idea was pretty simple. You had this handle and you could actually rotate this, and you could actually bring in more air, less air, at least allow some air to release. They called it no draft ventilation from their ventiplanes. And I really love the fact that at one point in their advertising, in their marketing materials, they said, "Do you smoke? Well, this is a way to get free flow through the cockpit, less fumes going through." Can you imagine that? That was part of the advertising that they were doing for people who were smoking. So these ventiplanes, and by the way, we saw these ventiplanes for a long time. In fact, if you look at a 1967 Camaro, they still have the ventiplanes. 1968, it goes away. So they were using these for quite some time to come. This steering wheel, this is what we refer to as a banjo steering wheel. When you look at these almost strings coming off, and the great thing about these is that it reduces the vibration coming through to the driver. When you were driving, it actually made it, well, less fatigue as you were driving down the road. Because you got to remember, we didn't have these super highways that we have today. The roads were still pretty bumpy back then. So the ability to have the steering wheel absorb some of that was great. Now, I love the dashboard of this. They called it the Beautiful Clear Vision Instrument Board was the actual marketing term for this. Kind of an Art Deco look to it, with these, the speedometer right here, the clock here. Look at this ashtray mounted up on the top. Just a really nice thing. This is the radio and how you would tune the radio. And by the way, I'm not sure if it's just the result of the way that this car has been restored and is here at the Martin Museum, but I noticed that both the heating unit and the radio down below have Cadillac names on them. Now, it's possible in the restoration process somebody simply put on Cadillac parts, but it's also possible that, once again, this was a companion to Cadillac. They may have been using those Cadillac parts and not even changing the name out. Now, there's another interesting thing about this car that's in the back. Now, this is a 2-passenger coupe. There is no back seat, so if you wanted to drive along, you had a lot of great storage space in the back, but technically no back seat. But they did have something that they refer to as opera seats. Look at this. You can pull it down, and you have a second place for people to sit. Now, don't get me wrong, these are not, tremendously comfortable, not a lot of room back there, but if you, in a pinch, needed to sit 2 people back there while you were on your way to the opera seats were exactly how you would do that. Now, once again, we didn't have any seat belts back then, and I'm sure it wasn't very safe, but at least it was a way for you to transport a couple of extra people while you were going someplace in your 1937 LaSalle. Pretty cool design. GM has actually looked at bringing back the LaSalle name a couple of times. The most interesting one was the 1955 LaSalle 2 concept car for the Motorama shows. Now, it was designed by a guy named Carl Renner. Really looks an awful lot like a mid-50s Corvette with that deep side scoop that, yep, you later saw that appear in the 1957 Corvette. There was also a 4-door LaSalle concept car as well. So how did LaSalle go from selling a record number of cars in 1937 to disappearing completely in 1940? Well, really, there were a number of factors, and just as the cars were becoming more streamlined, General Motors decided it needed to become more streamlined as well. In fact, they eliminated a number of divisions during the 1930s. And this, once again, was slotting between Buick and Cadillac, and they basically decided they didn't need something to do that. They were simply eating into the margins of both of those. The other problem was that this was competing with the Packard, and the Packard, while it was a little more expensive, was also a little more luxurious. It was a little less expensive than the Cadillac, but still providing a lot of luxury. And once again, the Packard was just doing better. So they decided it was better to focus on the Buick, better to focus on the Cadillac, and let the LaSalle go, which is really unfortunate because, once again, an absolutely beautiful car, great design. And once again, this is one of Harley Earl's favorites. Harley Earl, of course, the man who was behind so much of the design work at General Motors over all those years. He made sure this car always looked great, was always on the forefront of styling. Today, LaSalle, well, it's just a footnote in the automotive evolution, but boy, what a beautiful footnote it is.